Oh, it's Friday, you bastards. Friday is what it is. And right now we have the Hennepin County Medical Examiner, Dr. Andrew Baker, on the stand testifying about the cause of death, the result of the autopsy that he personally performed prior to. He's very cute, I must say. He reminds me of my friend Glenn. Glenn Abbott. Yeah, he looks just like Glenn Abbott is what it is. But anyway, that said, before he was on the stand, Andrew Baker, that is, who looks like a 1980s fashion model, is, you know, that's why he reminds me of Glenn. Anyway, before that, we had Dr. Lindsay Thomas. She is a forensic pathologist, and she actually looked at all the evidence that was developed during the autopsy and made some conclusions about the cause of death herself. Now, the cause of death, according to her, the cause of death, according to the Sergeant Steiger, who testified a couple days ago, the cause of death, according to Dr. Martin Tobin, who testified yesterday, the cause of death, according to Dr. Smock, who also testified yesterday, positional asphyxiation, meaning the cop, Chauvin, stood on top of George Floyd for so long with so much weight on top of his neck, back, and chest area, face down on the ground with his hands behind his back, and caused him to die. Okay, so let us listen to Dr. Andrew Baker, who looks just like Glenn Abbott, talking about George Floyd's lungs.
Panels or screens too from the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's office?
Yes, all of our postmortem toxicology is done by NMS.
Are you familiar with a toxicologist named Dr. Eisenschmidt?
Yes, I know Dan.
Brett's leaning towards Dudley Do right at this point.
Dr. Eisenschmidt testified here just time flies. I don't know if it was yesterday or 2 days ago.
Little Dr. Ronnie Jackson in there
testified
too.
Here. Do you have a good opinion of him as a toxicologist?
He has been great to work with so far. We
Hold on. Objection is sustained.
Irrelevant.
Well, you know Dr. Eisenschmidt.
I do.
Did you examine the contents of Mr. Floyd's stomach as part of your autopsy?
I did.
What did you note regarding the contents?
Counselor, can I refer to my report so that I don't
Yes,
speak?
if it helps refresh your recollection.
I'm simply going to quote what I dictated as part of the postmortem exam. The stomach contains approximately 450 milliliters of dark brown fluid with innumerable soft fragments of gray-white food particulate matter resembling bread.
Did you note anything resembling either a pill or pill fragments in the stomach contents?
I did not.
Oh, wow. Wow, no
Did you
pills.
do any testing of the contents of Mr. Floyd's stomach as a part of the toxicology assessment for Mr. Floyd?
So I wouldn't do any testing of that. It is possible that we could send it to a lab like NMS for testing, but I did not request that.
So were you aware of whether or not Mr. Floyd had tested positive for COVID?
Yes, I was aware of that. Not at the time I did the autopsy, but I became aware of that later.
Was that significant to you in any way?
That he had tested positive for COVID?
Yes, sir.
I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by significant. This was very early in the pandemic, and we were still scrambling to figure out things like autopsy safety protocols and what we should be wearing. So in that sense, it was significant. In Mr. Floyd's specific case, the fact that he had been COVID positive 7 or 8 weeks before he passed away did not factor into my cause of death determination because I didn't see any signs of COVID at his autopsy, and his lungs did not have any of the stigmata of COVID that I would expect to see under the microscope.
So was he clinically symptomatic from your point of view?
I can't assess that because I didn't know Mr. Floyd when he was alive. To the best of my knowledge, he was generally healthy on May 25th before the events of that evening. I'm unaware that he was suffering from any acute COVID symptoms at that time.
You also know that Mr. Floyd had sickle cell trait. What can you tell us about that?
Sickle cell trait is carried by about 8% of Americans of African heritage. What it means is that one of the genes that codes for the beta chain of hemoglobin has an abnormal substitution in it. If you just have sickle cell trait, chances are you will go through life and never have any symptoms from it because you make plenty of normal hemoglobin. That's very different than sickle cell disease, which means that both of the genes have that gene substitution, and then you have sickle cell disease. People with sickle cell disease can get very severe anemia. They can have sickle cell crises. They're subject to a variety of infections and other complications. But Mr. Floyd didn't have that. He just had the one gene for sickle cell trait. I wouldn't even have known that, except that it happens that people who have sickle cell trait, when you take a biopsy of one of their tissues and put it in formaldehyde, which is what pathologists do with all tissue, the formaldehyde can cause cells to sickle as a post-mortem artifact. And so when I saw that on Mr. Floyd's slides, I immediately called the hospital lab and I said, do you have a peripheral blood smear for Mr. Floyd? And it turned out they had made a blood smear during his CPR. And so I had a pathologist who specializes in blood disorders look at the slide and confirm there was no evidence that Mr. Floyd was sickling on his peripheral smear during life. I did also have our lab then run a sickle cell quantitation, which means they actually quantify the abnormal hemoglobin in the blood. And sure enough, that came back with the exact number that would be consistent with Mr. Floyd having sickle cell trait. So it's really just a fluke that it got picked up at autopsy. In my opinion, it doesn't have anything to do with why he died.
All right. What about paraganglioma, a kind of tumor? I'll just ask you about the paraganglioma as to whether you found or concluded that it had anything to do with Mr. Floyd's death.
So the short answer is I don't feel Mr. Floyd's paraganglioma had anything to do with his death. What we're talking about is an incidental tumor that I happened to find in his pelvis during the autopsy. I did look at it under the microscope. The most likely diagnosis is a paraganglioma, but I have no reason to believe that had anything to do with Mr. Floyd's death.
Okay. So Dr. Baker, want to switch and talk about the death certificate.
Okay.
So if we could pull up Exhibit 194. First, I'd like to talk to you about the press release report.
Okay.
And ask you first, Dr. Baker, if you would just identify what this is for the record.
Yes, what you are looking at is the final press release my office put out once I had reached my conclusion as to the cause and manner of Mr. Floyd's death.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what it means to certify a death?
To certify death as a physician means that you fill in the decedent's cause of death and their manner of death. And if their manner of death is other than natural, then you also have to fill in the how injury occurred box on the death certificate. Death certificates are relatively standard in the United States. Most of what's on them is largely dictated by the Centers for Disease Control. They vary a little bit in appearance from state to state, but the core elements are pretty much the same in every jurisdiction. Most of what's on a death certificate is actually filled in by family members and the funeral director. So, what's the decedent's full name? Where were they born? What are the names of their parents? Did they ever serve in the armed forces? There's all kinds of things that are captured. The medical examiner's primary role, again, as I mentioned, is the cause of death, the manner of death, and the how injury occurred. Most death certificates in the United States are actually filled out by clinicians, meaning your primary care doctor that you see.
Okay, so he's explaining the cause and manner of death, which are two different things. We learned that today if you were watching. Dr. Lindsay Thomas taught us that. There's, lots of causes, but only 5 manners. Accidental, homicide, what was the other? George Floyd's is homicide. That's the manner of death. He died from a homicide, not an accidental overdose, which would have been accidental.